You've grown up with the image of the vampire, pale aristocrat, velvet cloak, fangs sinking into a soft throat. The folklore you know is a romantic fiction invented by Victorian novelists and Hollywood studios. But long before Bram Stoker sat down to write, before any Romanian peasant whispered the word strigoi, the thing we call the vampire was already ancient. Not a monster, a system, a technology of control that civilizations use to regulate the most forbidden substance on earth, blood. The truth about why every culture from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica invented the vampire is not a story about superstition. It is a story about power, and what that power required will force you to reconsider what you think you know about the dead. The official story you have heard is simple and clean. Vampires were invented to explain death. Pre-scientific cultures needed a reason for tuberculosis outbreaks, for sudden wasting diseases, for bodies that did not decay the way they should. So they imagined the dead rose at night to feed on the living. It is a neat explanation, tidy, and entirely wrong on the deepest level. It mistakes the symptom for the cause. Every culture that invented a blood-drinking entity also had a detailed legal code about blood itself. The two were never separate. Consider the first known vampire laws in human history. They were not written in Transylvania. They were written in Babylon around the year 1770 BCE on a stone tablet called the Code of Hammurabi. Law number 215 addresses a specific crime involving a temple priestess who uses a man's blood in a ritual. The punishment is not execution. It is being declared taboo, untouchable, expelled from all human community. Notice what is missing. No mention of immortality. No mention of fangs. The crime is not that blood was spilled. It is that blood was used outside the control of the state. That is the first crack in the official story. Think about that crack for a moment. The moment you see it, the entire folkloric explanation begins to split open. If this is the first time you've heard that the vampire myth was a legal mechanism first and a ghost story second, you are at the threshold of a much deeper unraveling. Subscribe now to follow that thread through every civilization that built its power on blood law, because what comes next will not just change what you think about vampires, it will change what you think about every rule you've ever been told is sacred. And once you've seen it, drop the word taboo in the comments so we know exactly where you joined the descent. But something does not fit. If vampires were just a folk explanation for disease, why did every ancient legal system treat blood drinking as a crime against social order, not a medical anomaly? In Egypt, the Book of the Dead spells out exactly what happens to the soul that drinks blood in the underworld. The soul is destroyed permanently. No judgment, no weighing of the heart, just annihilation. The oldest religious texts in the world do not treat blood consumption as a metaphor for illness. They treat it as a direct violation of the cosmic hierarchy. The same pattern appears in the Vedas, in the Zoroastrian texts, in the early Chinese legal codes. Everywhere the message is the same. Blood belongs to the gods, to the state, or to the lineage, never to the individual, never to the dead. This is not a pattern that emerges spontaneously from scattered superstitious minds. It is a pattern that was engineered. Now the contradiction escalates. In Greece, around the year 400 BCE, the writer Philostratus described a creature called the Empusa. It drank blood. It could change shape. It seduced travelers at night. Sound familiar? But the details matter. Philostratus explicitly says the Empusa was not a corpse that had risen. It was a spirit sent by the goddess Hecate to punish those who had violated blood oaths. The punishment was not random. It was targeted. The Empusa did not prey on everyone. It preyed on oath breakers, on those who had spilled blood outside the rules. The vampire was not a mindless predator. It was an executioner, a tool of cosmic law enforcement, and the law it enforced was about whose blood you were permitted to touch. By the time you reach medieval Europe, the pattern has become surgical. When the first documented vampire panics erupted in the 12th century, they did not begin in villages where people died of plague. They began in villages where property disputes over inheritance had been resolved in ways that broke the bloodline. The accused vampire was always someone who had died without legitimate heirs, or someone who had contested a will before they died. The Church's own records preserved in the Vatican archives make this connection explicit. A vampire could not be a stranger. The vampire was always a member of the family, always someone whose blood ties were unresolved. This is the moment where you have to decide whether you want to be inside this knowledge or outside it. Because once you see that the vampire was the enforcer of inheritance law, a supernatural auditor of wills, you are no longer a passive consumer of folklore. You are an initiate into the hidden police system of civilization. Subscribe to become part of the small group that knows the real function of every monster story that still circulates in the culture. And tell us in the comments, what story in your own family history about an unresolved inheritance or a contested will now feels different in the light of this revelation? The hidden truth is this: civilizations did not invent vampires because they were afraid of death. They invented vampires because they needed a way to terrify people into respecting the rules of blood inheritance. Blood was property. It was the only form of wealth that could not be counterfeited. If you could control who mixed blood with whom, you controlled the transfer of land, of titles, of power itself. The vampire story was the enforcement mechanism. It was the threat whispered to every younger son who might resent his inheritance, to every daughter married against her will, to every slave who dreamed of freedom. Break the blood rules, and your own dead family will rise to drain you dry. This is not folklore. This is internal policing. The vampire was not a monster in the dark. The vampire was the dark that the powerful learned to weaponize. Now confront what this means for you. You were raised in a world that still runs on the same logic. You call it estate planning, inheritance tax, marriage licenses. You call it legal contracts and blood tests and paternity suits. But the structure beneath every one of these systems is exactly the same as the ancient vampire law. Control of blood, control of who is permitted to transfer what to whom, and under whose authority. The vampire stories you were told as a child were training. They taught you that some lines should never be crossed, that the dead have power over the living, that blood is sacred. You absorbed this teaching before you could speak. This is where the forbidden truth becomes impossible to ignore. In the year 1897, when Bram Stoker published Dracula, he did not invent the rules. He assembled them into a single fictional narrative for the first time. But the rules themselves were already thousands of years old. The vampire cannot enter without invitation. It cannot cross running water. It cannot see its own reflection. It is repelled by holy symbols. Every one of these rules maps to an ancient blood law. The invitation requirement is the rule against forced marriage. The running water boundary is the boundary between clan territories. The lack of reflection is the legal doctrine that the dead have no rights over property. And the holy symbol is the state itself, which has always claimed the exclusive right to spill blood in your name. What remains is the choice you must make about what to do with this knowledge. You now see the architecture. You cannot unsee it. Every time you hear a story about a monster that drinks blood, you will recognize the legal system hidden beneath the fangs. The vampire was never supernatural. It was the most rational invention of the ancient world, a perfect deterrent, a flawless piece of social engineering that has outlasted every empire that created it. Your own mind has been shaped by this story. Your own sense of what is forbidden about blood, about family, about inheritance, was installed in you by dead hands that understood power better than any modern lawyer ever could. So here's the question that will echo long after this video ends. If vampire stories were social engineering, what other monsters are doing the same work right now? What fears that you believe are natural were actually installed in your mind to protect a system you never agreed to? The answer is the thread that connects every culture that ever lived in fear of the dark. And once you pull that thread, the entire fabric of civilization begins to unravel. The next video will show you the first one, the monster that has never been named, but you already know it exists. You can feel it right now in the silence between your own heartbeats. You have been raised inside a cage built from stories. The cage is beautiful. It is lined with velvet and illuminated by candlelight, but the bars are made of laws written in blood 4,000 years before your grandparents were born. Every time you feel a flicker of unease in a graveyard, every time your pulse quickens at the mention of a curse, you are not experiencing ancestral memory. You are experiencing the after-image of a control system that was designed to govern the most intimate transaction a human being could make, the transfer of life itself from one body to another. What makes this truth unbearable is that the system worked. It worked so perfectly that you cannot imagine a world without it. You cannot picture a society where blood is not connected to identity, to inheritance, to family. You cannot picture a society where the dead simply dissolve into the earth without taking their property with them. That is the mark of successful engineering. The subject does not know they are being engineered at all. This is the razor's edge where you must act before the final turn. The engineering is so seamless that most people will watch this entire video and still walk away unchanged, still believing the vampire is a creature of superstition. But you are not most people. You have already felt the architecture behind your own instincts. Subscribe now so you do not miss the next revelation, the one that names the monster that has never been named. And before you leave, type this single word in the comments: engineered, because that is what you now know yourself to be, and that recognition is the only edge you will ever need. The vampire, in the end, is not a creature of the night. It is a creature of daylight. a creature of courts and churches and notary seals. The fangs were real, but they were not made of bone. They were made of custom and law and the slow, patient weight of tradition pressing down on every generation. And the blood it drank was not the blood of the living. It was the blood of possibility. The futures that were never allowed to happen because someone in power had decided centuries ago that certain veins must never be opened. No single revelation will break this architecture. No one video will dissolve a system that has been reinforced by every story told in every culture since the first clay tablet was inscribed. But the first step toward freedom is the same in every age. Recognize the cage. Then decide, in full knowledge, whether you will remain inside it. The cage has no lock because the door was never meant to be found. The vampire myth did not fade when you stopped believing in monsters. It simply changed form. It lives now in every contract you sign without reading, in every family obligation you honor without questioning, in every drop of blood you give to a lab without asking who owns the data. The modern world did not abolish the vampire. It just replaced the fangs with fine print. You will walk away from this video and the world will look exactly the same. The streets will be lit. The graves will be quiet. The monsters will stay in fiction where you have been trained to keep them. But something will have shifted in the architecture of your attention. The next time you hear a story about a creature that feeds on the life of others, you will catch yourself looking for the law it is enforcing. You will see the cage, and that seeing is the only real rebellion there has ever been. The ancient Babylonians carved their warnings in stone. The Greeks wove them into drama. The church built them into the fabric of every medieval village. And you inherited them all, not as laws, but as instincts, as fears that feel natural but were planted. The truth about the vampire was never about blood. It was about the sentence that every civilization whispers to its children the moment they are old enough to understand ownership. Your blood is not your own. That sentence is the oldest vampire of all, and it has never once needed to rise from the grave because it was never dead to begin with.